All right, remnants of the integumentary system. We're going to start by talking about melanocytes. And remember, melanocytes are those pigmented cells in the basal layer of the epidermis. And the pigment that they produce is called melanin. Now, it wouldn't do any good if all of the pigment was in the basal layer. So what these cells do is they have cytoplasmic extensions that extend out into the more superficial layers of the epidermis, push those melanin granules into those extensions, and thereby providing some sort of shade to the basal layer of the epidermis and protecting those cells that are capable of dividing, because remember, all of these cells up here are not dividing. It's only the cells in this basal layer. And so dividing cells, if damaged by sunlight, can produce cancerous cells, as we discussed in a previous lecture. So you want those basal layer of cells to be protected. And the more melanin you produce, the darker your skin's going to be. Now, although melanin can produce differences in skin color or even changes in skin color with exposure to the sun, skin color is a result of a multitude of factors, or a combination of those factors, that influence not only the amount of melanin in the epidermis, but the amount of other substances in the dermis or epidermis that can influence skin color as well. So we'll talk about a few of those. So as far as genetics goes, remember, all people have the same number of melanocytes in their skin. So I don't have any more melanocytes in my skin, being a Caucasian person, than someone of African descent has in their skin. The difference is that somebody who has really dark skin genetically produces more melanin. All right, and people with light skin produce less melanin. Now, what the sun can do is stimulate those melanocytes to produce more melanin temporarily to shield you from the sun, thus preventing injury and mutations to that basal layer of cells, which we talked about. Now, another thing about the sun which can change skin color is sunburn. And sunburn is different than what a suntan is. Sunburn is UV radiation causing literally a burn injury to the skin. The skin gets inflamed, and that's what produces that red color. And the red color does not equal the brown color that you get from sun tanning. That's a result of melanin, not a result of the inflammatory reaction. They are completely independent processes. And being independent processes, melanin does not offer protection against sunburn. It offers protection against the development of cancer in those basal layer of cells. Environmental factors that can alter skin color: sunlight, UV light. We talked about that in the previous slide, so I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. But also physiological factors. In people who have light skin or very light complexions, you will tend to see that if there is more blood going to an area of skin, the person's going to be a little more pink, such as when you get done exercising and you look at a person, their cheeks are flushed. That would be an example of more blood to the surface of the skin, causing that change in skin color in the localized region, versus less blood getting to an area or less oxygen in blood, and that will tend to make your skin take on a bluish tinge, which we refer to as cyanosis. The blood vessel condition: if blood vessels are dilated, more blood's going to go to an area. It's going to appear more pink, like we talked about. If blood vessels are constricted, not as much blood's going to go to that area, and it's not necessarily going to turn blue, but you're going to see that as more of loss of color. So like when you do the capillary refill test and you look at your finger and it's white temporarily, that's because there's less blood in that area, and then within a second or two it turns back pink because blood flow has resumed. If you have a lot of carotene in your diet, Yellow, orange vegetables. Skin can appear yellowish in color. Also, if you have jaundice, which is can be result from a multitude of factors, but it's a buildup of bilirubin in your tissues. That can also lead to a skin color, but that is more a reflection of a pathological condition rather than too much of a certain nutrient in your diet. The one thing I did not see covered in the crash course videos, which I found odd, and correct me if you did find it in there, is the mention of the erector pili muscle. And that's these little muscles that are within the dermis of the skin attached to hair follicles containing smooth muscle cells. And when a person gets upset or when a person gets cold, these erector pili muscles will contract, pull this hair follicle erect, and the hairs will stand straight up. And not only do we see that as hair standing straight up, but we also see that as goose bumps or goose pimples or goose flesh, those raised areas of skin. And it's thought that the reason why these erector pili muscles exist and the hair stands up on end is because if you increase the surface area of hair or the volume of hair on the surface of your skin, you can trap more air. And if your skin is warm in that air, you provide a cushion of warm air between the surface of the hairs and your underlying skin. So a warming mechanism. Another thing about nails is that nails are a really good indicator of a person's health. They tend to mirror the health condition of an individual. I put this guy down here. This is Mickey Rourke, and in a movie of his, I noticed that his fingernails had this raised appearance, and typically you'll see that raised appearance club nails in people who either smoke or who have or lung disease or some sort of cardiovascular disease, and it's a compensatory response from not having enough oxygen in your blood. So when I looked him up, sure enough, he is a chain smoker. I didn't find that he has other underlying conditions, but he is a smoker, which is possible that is reflected in the condition of his nails. Now, if you look down this list here, it shows the nail appearance and associated conditions. I'm not going to go through them, but it'll give you an idea of if you have something going on with your nails, this is what it might mean. And when you're looking at patients, it could be a really good quick indicator of what kind of things you're dealing with as far as the diagnosis is concerned. Now, although skin is the best protector for the inside of our body, it can get damaged and compromise the integrity of the protective layer. And so one of those types of damage are cuts. And we divide those into different types of cuts. Shallow cuts, such as paper cuts that hurt like crazy, but they fill in very rapidly just by the epithelial cells dividing, filling that in, and you don't even know you've had it by the time it heals. And then there are deeper cuts. Deeper cuts extend into the dermis and the subcutaneous layers, and when they extend into those layers, you're going to have bleeding. So you're going to have clots form. Those blood clots and the dried fluids are going to lead to a scab, which protects the underlying tissue while the cut heals. And then we can have large open wounds, and large open wounds can lead to scars, and we'll talk about those processes in the next couple slides. So another type of integumentary damage are burns, and they're divided into first degree or superficial burns, where just the epidermis is burned, that's very thin superficial layer that's thinner than a piece of hair, or a piece of paper, I'm sorry. A second degree burn, which is a partial thickness burn, which the epidermis and some of the dermis is burned. Typically with these you'll see blisters form and fluid forming under those blisters from the damaged tissue capillaries, providing an inflammatory response. And then third degree burns are full thickness burns where you go through the epidermis and through the dermis, and possibly even into the subcutaneous tissue, and fourth degree burns where they go even beyond that, underneath the subcutaneous tissue, muscle, bone can even be affected. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but you'll probably get these in your clinical medicine class. So just be aware of the types of burns and how thick each one is affected. All right, so with healing and tissue repair, I'm going to refer you to this video to watch, but the three general things that happen: you form a blood clot, you lay down granulation tissue, which is what this is right here, and then epithelial tissue fills in by mitosis. And the video will go into more detail than that and show you animations of how that happens. So when we talk about types of healing, the first type is simple resolution, where normal tissue is damaged but not destroyed. In other words, cells are hurt but they don't die. Whatever caused the injury or the damage is neutralized and destroyed, and the structure returns to normal functional capacity relatively quickly. And an example of this would be getting hit in the face, and it turns red for a little while and then resumes back to normal function. Regeneration says that some tissue is lost, whether it be due to whatever caused the injury got rid of the tissue, or the tissue died and sloughed off, and that tissue is replaced with tissue that is structurally and functionally identical to the tissue that was lost. So for regeneration, healthy neighboring cells will undergo mitosis. In other words, they'll start dividing and replace the cells lost in that tissue. So if we go back to that picture where I showed you the skin with the granulation tissue, all of that granulation tissue is a nice bed for epithelial cells to start filling in the area by dividing. Another example would be that paper cut that we talked about, where the cells will fill in that gap that the paper cut caused and replace it with identical tissue, identical skin tissue. And finally, repair by scar. By definition, a scar is simply connective tissue that's laid down in place of skin because the wound is too big for skin to actually divide and fill in the gap. All right, so dead cells replaced by viable cells of a different type. Here it would be fibroblasts. And the new cells form granulation tissue, which lays down a matrix to lay down more collagen fibers, which is what these fibroblasts are going to produce. Collagen fibers, which is actually what forms the scar tissue. When that granulation tissue is laid down, realize that it is connective tissue and it's highly vascularized, meaning there's a lot of blood vessels there, and that's why it has that deep red meaty appearance to it. And that is a fertile ground for scar tissue and fibroblasts to be laid down. Now, when you talk about wound repair by scar, we talk about it with surgical incisions as healing by first or primary intention, or healing by secondary or second intention. Healing by primary intention, in other words, the surgeon's primary intention is to make sure that you have your skin integrity back the way it was before they cut into you. So they're going to have minimal tissue loss, and a very small scar. That's why they suture the wound closed, or that's why they staple the wound closed, or that's why they use the glue to close that wound, so that the wound edges are approximated as close as possible, minimizing the amount of tissue loss and the amount of scar tissue. Now, healing by secondary intention means, well, we couldn't do what we wanted to do. We couldn't minimize the tissue loss and minimize the scar tissue, so we're going to go with a extensive scar that's going to be left there, and it's better than having open an open wound. And so this slide is just showing you the difference between primary intention, healing by primary intention, and healing by secondary intention. Notice the suture here approximating the wound edges. There's a small clot, inflammation, and at the end there's very minimal scar tissue, and the skin looks very similar to what it was before. Whereas by healing by secondary intention, the wound is too big maybe to approximate the edges, so we let the clot fill in, a scab forms, and at the end scar tissue fills in that area because there is too much surface area for the epithelial cells to fill it in. So fibroblasts get laid down, they're laying down collagen, and then you have the scar tissue. And what you want to keep in mind is that scar tissue, although it does cover the wound and does heal the wound so you don't have it open and vulnerable to infection, scar tissue is not as strong as the original epithelial tissue was. Now, one of the reasons why you don't want extensive amounts of scar tissue is that scar tissue can cause complications. Sometimes you can have contractures which lead to deformities. So let's say you have a wound on your finger. Scar tissue forms, and then your finger remains in a contracted state because of that scar tissue kind of bent the joints slightly, causing a deformity. Or if the scar tissue forms in the digestive tract and you bind loops of the small intestine together, forming adhesions and maybe forming fistulas between areas of the small intestine. That would be another example of complications that result from too much scar tissue being formed. All right, very briefly, we'll talk about body temperature regulation and heat loss. So our body temperature, which is around 37 degrees Celsius, as a number, but always remember that there is a range of normal temperature. Shouldn't always be exactly 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. But our temperature stays relatively constant due to negative feedback mechanisms that I alluded to back in an earlier lecture. The set point temperature, or that 37 degrees Celsius, is controlled by the body's by the hypothalamus. And think of the hypothalamus as like the thermostat for the body. So it gets incoming signals from the skin. Skin tells the hypothalamus that it's cooling down. The hypothalamus will kick in mechanisms to raise the temperature back up, and then those signals will be shut off. The human body has to strike a balance between the amount of heat it's producing and the amount of heat that it's losing. And so we have to take into consideration the types of heat loss from the body. And you should probably be familiar with all of these already. Radiation is the primary means of heat loss. So if you're standing next to somebody that is warmer than you, you can feel the heat radiating off of them. That would be radiation. And since we're constantly producing heat, we're constantly radiating heat. It's a way that we lose heat to the environment. Conduction: if we touch something and we warm that thing up by touching it, that is considered conductive heat loss. If air passes over our warm skin and takes away the warmth, that would be convection heat loss. And finally, if we sweat and that sweat evaporates, carrying the heat from our skin surface with it, that would be an example of evaporative heat loss, all of which remove heat from your body. Now, living in Northwest Ohio, or being in Northwest Ohio, we don't want to lose too much heat to the cooler environment that exists throughout most of the year. So we have to have mechanisms to conserve heat. And some of those mechanisms include the blood vessels in the dermis, and students make this mistake a lot. It's not blood vessels throughout your entire body, it's blood vessels in your skin, in the dermal layer. They will constrict, so less blood flow goes to the skin, therefore less heat goes to the skin, and that will slow heat loss. When it's cold out, we also want to inhibit sweat glands because we don't want to have evaporative heat loss in cold conditions. And our muscles will involuntarily contract. And when our muscles involuntarily contract, which we refer to as shivering, that generates heat. And so that doesn't necessarily control heat loss, but it ends up generating more heat to compensate for the amount of heat that's being lost. And this slide's just showing you an example of vasoconstriction, where not as much blood is going to the surface of the skin. It's staying more deep, and therefore you're not going to have as much heat being lost. It's going to stay inside. Whereas the dermal blood vessels will dilate, and more blood will go to the surface of the skin, and that will, again, as we discussed earlier, change the color of your skin. It'll have that reddish, pinkish hue, and heat will escape from the body. And then cooler blood will return to the venous circulation and back to the heart. And so this is a negative feedback loop for if temperatures get too high in your body or temperatures get too low. Remember, the first place to detect that would be in the skin. Skin sends a message to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will then send messages to the effector organs to either decrease body temperature or raise body temperature. So I'll let you guys go through the negative feedback loop, which you're probably already familiar with, to review on your own. Now, if we can't regulate temperature adequately, we end up with problems. And two of those problems include hypothermia, in other words, low body temperature or reduced body temperature below the set point, consistently below the set point, core body temperature consistently below the set point. And this can be dangerous because if your body temperature gets too low, things start slowing down. If they slow down to the point where they're not functioning anymore, that can lead to death. On the other hand, you have hyperthermia, which is an elevated body temperature consistently above the set point. And that is usually not a result of too much heat, but our body to inadequately cool in hot environments or during exercise. And of course, we know when temperatures get too high, proteins start to denature. And when proteins start to denature in cells, especially nervous system cells, then those nervous system cells aren't going to function properly. Nerve pathways are going to shut down. Therefore, regulation of your body is going to shut down, and that could result in death as well.